Lady Vane is sitting by the fire in the long drawing room at Ashcombe Hall, in the hills of Shropshire, on a Tuesday afternoon in late October of 1880, and outside the tall windows the rain has been falling since before dawn, steady and grey and entirely uninterested in stopping. She does not mind it, if anything. The weather has improved the room. It gives the fire a reason to be built up higher than usual, 3 fresh logs laid across the coals not an hour ago, and it gives the deep armchairs and the worn Turkish carpet and the smell of wood smoke and hot tea a settled, cocooned quality that a bright day never quite manages. She is wearing a morning dress of dove grey wool, high at the throat, the sleeves trimmed in a darker velvet, and her hair is pinned in the smooth, disciplined coils that her lady's maid spent 40 minutes constructing before breakfast. A novel lies open and face down across her knee, though she has not read a page of it in the last quarter hour. She is watching the rain instead, and finding the watching agreeable. Across the room, 2 of her houseguests are playing cards at a small table near the window, a Miss Redfern and a Mr. Calloway, both of them laughing quietly at something in the hand just dealt. Her third guest, an older woman in dark green silk, has fallen asleep in her chair with her needlework still resting in her lap, her mouth very slightly open, entirely unembarrassed by it, because the room is warm enough and private enough. The tea things sit on a low table between them, a silver pot still faintly steaming, a plate of seed cake barely touched, and a housemaid has already been in twice to make up the fire without anyone in the room quite registering that she was there at all, which is precisely how the household prefers it. Rain streaks the diamond panes of the windows in long wavering lines, and somewhere further off in the house a clock strikes the half-hour, and the whole scene has the particular, self-satisfied stillness of a room in which everyone present has decided that today, of all days, they are glad to be exactly where they are. This is the version of a Victorian rainy day that has survived into the present almost perfectly intact, repeated in period dramas and painted advertisements and the pinned images of 100 modern accounts of cozy historical living. Rain against old glass, a fire built up high, wool blankets, hot tea, a novel, an afternoon with nowhere to be. It is a genuinely lovely image, and it is not, strictly speaking, a lie. Lady Vane's afternoon really did look something like this, on a great many wet days, across a great many English autumns. But the room she is sitting in required an enormous, continuous, and entirely invisible effort to produce, an effort that had been underway since 4 o'clock that morning and would not end until long after she had gone up to dress for dinner. And almost none of that effort belonged to her or to anyone drinking tea in that room. It belonged to a household of servants working below her, behind her and above her, in wet clothes, in freezing corridors, on hands and knees on cold stone, carrying, scrubbing, and hauling through a downpour that for them was not cozy in the slightest. Beneath the fire and the novel and the pleasant sound of rain on glass, the story of what a wet day actually cost in a house like Ashcombe Hall is a good deal more complicated, considerably more uncomfortable, and far more revealing of what English country life in 1880 actually required. This is 1880, and the English country house has spent the better part of a century perfecting a very particular kind of theatre, one in which comfort appears to arise naturally out of a well-run home the way warmth rises from a fire, effortlessly, almost by accident. Rain was supposed to be the great equalizer of this theatre, the one weather condition guaranteed to make everyone in the house, family and guest alike, simply grateful to be indoors. Every etiquette manual and domestic magazine of the period leaned into the idea. A wet day was an opportunity for reading, for letter writing, for unhurried conversation by the fire, precisely the kind of day the modern imagination has since turned into a whole aesthetic of candlelight and knitted shawls and window seats. What none of those manuals mention, because it did not need mentioning among the people who wrote and read them, is that a rainy day did not reduce the labor of running a country house. It multiplied it. Every fire built up higher meant more coal, carried up more staircases. Every guest who came in from riding or shooting despite the weather, and a great many of them did exactly that, meant mud dragged across stone floors that had to be scrubbed out before it dried into a permanent stain, and boots that had to be cleaned and dried and blacked by hand. Every soaked coat and skirt of heavy wool, a fabric that in this era could weigh several pounds when dry and considerably more once wet through, had to be dried somewhere in a house with no mechanical way of drying anything, which meant steam and damp, and a laundry room turned into something closer to a swamp than a workroom. Over the next several hours, we are going to follow that Tuesday plank by plank. The mud tracked in from the moor, the boots that needed blacking by firelight, the coal that needed doubling in every grate in the house, the wool that refused to dry no matter where it was hung, the particular smell that built up in a house, sealed tight against the weather, the damp that crept into the walls and floors of the rooms below stairs when nobody upstairs ever had reason to go, and the specific quiet toll all of it took on the bodies of the people who were never, under any circumstances, supposed to be seen doing any of it. This video is that other story, not the fireside one. The one that took place below the drawing room floor and above it in the attics, in the sculleries and boot rooms and coal cellars of a house like Ashcombe Hall on a single, ordinary, thoroughly wet Tuesday in the autumn of 1880. It is not a polite discussion of quaint, old inconveniences. It is a real accounting of what a rainy day actually demanded from the people who made Lady Vane's afternoon look as effortless as it did. Before we go any further, if this is the kind of history you find yourself wanting more of, the real version rather than the postcard one, take a moment now and subscribe. It costs nothing and it helps keep this kind of research going. And if there is a specific detail in this story that surprises you, something you had never considered about a house like this one, leave it in a comment. I do read them. Let us begin then, not in the drawing room, but in the scullery passage at the back of the house, where the day had already been underway for hours before anyone upstairs had so much as opened an eye. The person whose day we are about to follow is a composite built from the documented duties, wages, and daily schedules of real under-housemaids and tweenies. Working in English country houses in this period, the kind of position recorded in household account books, domestic service manuals, call her Alice Pryor. She is 16 years old, and she has worked at Ashcombe Hall since she was 13, first as a scullery maid, scrubbing pots in a low-ceilinged room behind the kitchen, and now, 3 years later, as what the household calls a tweenie, short for between maid. Her position that exists precisely because a house the size of Ashcombe Hall generates more work than its senior servants can manage and not quite enough income to justify hiring anyone senior to manage it. A tweenie belongs to no single department. She works for the cook in the mornings and the housekeeper in the afternoons. And on a day like this one, when the rain has doubled every task in the house at once, she effectively works for everyone. Ashcombe Hall keeps a household staff of some 24 indoors, modest by the standards of the great aristocratic estates further south, where 50 or more servants was not unusual, but substantial for a gentry family of Sir Edward's standing. Below Alice in the household's rigid order stands only the scullery maid and the hall boy, a wiry, perpetually cold 13-year-old named Sam, who is going to matter a great deal to this story once the boots start arriving. Above her stand the housemaids proper, then the lady's maid, Miss Pruitt, who dresses only Lady Vane and answers to no one else in the house. Then the cook. Yeoman, who rules the kitchen with an authority nobody questions, and at the top of the whole visible structure, the housekeeper, Mrs. Garrow, and the butler, Mr. Hedges, who divide the household between them, the way a general divides an army into land and sea. Alice earns £12 a year, paid quarterly, along with her board, her uniform, and a narrow bed in the attic, a wage she would need to save in full for more than 4 centuries, at that rate, to equal what a single one of Sir Edward's dinner parties cost to put on the table. Physically, 3 years of this work have already left their mark on her. Her hands are red and rough across the knuckles, chapped from cold water and harsh soap, and in winter she gets chilblains, the itching, swollen patches that develop on fingers and toes kept cold and damp for too many hours at a stretch. And an ailment so common among servants of her rank that household medical guides of the period simply assumed their readers already knew the word. She is thin, not from any particular deprivation, but from a diet heavy in bread and wheat tea, and light on almost everything else. And she has already developed a faint, permanent stoop in her lower back, the particular curve that comes from a life spent bent double over grates, floors, and low fireplaces since the age of 13. Her knees have taken worse damage still. Housemaid's knee, a swollen, aching inflammation of the joint caused by hours spent kneeling on cold stone and bare wood, was common enough among servants of her rank that it had its own recognized name in the medical texts of the period. Ruth Goodman, the historian who has spent years actually performing this kind of Victorian domestic labor for television rather than simply reading about it, has written about developing housemaid's knee herself within weeks of taking up the daily kneeling, scrubbing, and great blacking the job required. A small, personal confirmation of exactly how fast this work reshapes a body that does it every day. What is expected of Alice every single day, rain or shine, is a schedule that begins before 5 in the morning and does not meaningfully end until 9:30 or 10 at night. She rises in the dark, in an attic room she shares with 2 other maids, and dresses quickly because the room holds no fire and never will, a detail we will return to later in far more uncomfortable terms. Her first job of the day, every day, is to descend the back stairs to the kitchen passage, riddle out the ashes from the previous night's fires, and lay and light new ones in the breakfast room, the morning room, and Lady Vane's private sitting room, all of it finished before the family wakes, so that when Lady Vane comes downstairs, the fire in her sitting room is already burning cheerfully, with no evidence whatsoever of the ash, the soot, or the servant who put it there. Invisibility, as we will see, is not an accident of Alice's position. It is one of the central requirements of it. She has one small vanity or something close to one. Tucked into the back pages of the small prayer book her mother gave her when she left home is a dried violet, pressed flat, gone the color of old parchment, picked from the hedge outside her parents' cottage on the morning she left for service. She does not show it to anyone, not the other maids, not even her particular friend among the kitchen staff, and she takes it out perhaps once a month, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, to look at it for a minute before putting it carefully away again. It is not sentimentality exactly. It is closer to evidence, proof kept in a drawer that a life existed for her before this one, a life she still privately intends to have some version of again one day in a cottage of her own, with a hedge of her own, and no one at all left to ring a bell for her. On this particular Tuesday, none of that ordinary hardship is the whole story, because the rain has been falling since well before Alice lit the first fire of the morning, and Sir Edward's shooting party, 5 gentlemen and their guns, 6 beaters, and a great many dogs, went out anyway. They were not due back until early afternoon. They are going to come back a good deal sooner than that, driven in early and thoroughly soaked by weather that has gotten considerably worse rather than better. And when they arrive, the ordinary difficulty of Alice's day is about to become something else entirely. The scene most people picture when they imagine a Victorian shooting party caught out in the rain is a fairly gentle one. Gentlemen ducking under a convenient oak, waiting out a shower, then riding home at an easy pace once the worst of it passes, damp but good-humoured, ready for a hot bath and a change of clothes. It is the kind of moment-period dramas handle with a laugh and a towel. What that picture leaves out is the actual condition of 5 grown men, a dozen dogs, and 6 beaters who have spent 4 hours walking heavy Shropshire clay in a downpour that never once let up, and what that condition looks like the moment it crosses the threshold of a house with polished stone floors. Sir Edward's party comes in through the side entrance a little after noon, considerably earlier than expected, and in considerably worse shape. Their boots alone have collected pounds of wet clay apiece, the heavy red-brown soil of the county gathering in the tread and around the welt of the leather, until each boot weighs nearly double what it did that morning. Their tweed coats, soaked through at the shoulders and dark with rain from collar to hem, are shedding water onto the flagstones with every step, and the dogs, 6 or 7 spaniels and retrievers let in ahead of their masters because nobody thought to stop them, are shaking themselves violently in the entrance hall, flinging a fine spray of muddy water across a good stretch of stone floor and the lower panels of the wainscoting. Mud from the moor is not a delicate substance. It works itself into the grooves between flagstones almost instantly, and if it is allowed to dry there, even for an hour, it sets into the joints of the stone in a way that no amount of scrubbing afterward will fully undo. Everyone below stairs at Ashcombe Hall understands this without being told. The mud has to come up now, while it is still wet enough to lift. That is the actual reality behind a scene the modern imagination has softened into something almost charming. The historian Pamela Sambrook, who spent decades researching the daily operations of English country houses from the record books and physical layouts left behind, has documented in detail how deliberately the entrance halls of houses, stone and marble floors, were chosen for grand entrance halls, not primarily for their beauty, though beauty mattered too, but because they were the only surfaces in the house that could be scrubbed clean of countryside mud on a regular basis without ruining them. A carpeted or wood-floored entrance, the kind a smaller or less wealthy household might have, would have been permanently stained within a season by a shooting party's boots. Stone could be scrubbed back to bare cleanliness again and again, provided somebody was willing to do the scrubbing on their knees, in cold water, as many times a week as the weather demanded. On this particular Tuesday, that somebody is Alice. Mrs. Garrow has her in the entrance hall within minutes of the party's arrival, a bucket of cold water and a stiff bristled brush in hand, working across the flagstones on her knees while 5 wet, cheerful gentlemen stand a few feet away complaining good-naturedly about the weather and calling for towels. Pine, entirely unbothered by the fact that a 16-year-old girl is scrubbing mud out from between the stones directly beneath their still dripping boots. The water in her bucket goes from clear to the color of weak tea within the first few minutes. He has to change it 3 times before the hall is presentable again. Her knees, already tender from the morning's great work, press into stone that has not had time to warm from the fires burning at either end of the room. And her hands, wrung out again and again in cold water, go numb somewhere around the second bucket. She does not stop to warm them. There is a good deal more mud to come, tracked in steadily as guests move between the hall, the gun room, and the stairs, and Mrs. Myers. Garrow has made it clear that the floor is to look, by the time the family sits down to a late luncheon, as though none of this happened at all. The broader pattern here is one that shows up across nearly every account of English country house service in this period. From Sambrook's research to Frank Dawes's History of Domestic Staff, to Judith Flanders's work on the physical architecture of Victorian homes. The comfort and grandeur a wealthy household displayed to its guests depended on erasing, as completely and as quickly as possible, every physical trace of the outside world the moment it crossed the threshold. Weather was the outside world's most persistent intrusion, and a house that wanted to look untouched by it needed a servant on permanent standby to make the intrusion disappear. The wealthier the house, the more elaborate this erasure became, not because wealthier families were dirtier, but because wealthier families entertained more, moved through more rooms, and generated more mud for someone else to remove. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that nobody in that hall, not Sir Edward, not his guests, not even Lady Vane, when she passed through it later that afternoon on her way to luncheon, gave the clean stone floor a second thought. That was, in the most literal sense, the entire point of Alice's work. A floor that draws attention to its own cleanliness has failed. The mud had to vanish so completely and so quietly that its removal left no impression at all, which meant that the labor behind it, cold and exhausting as it was, had been designed from the outset never to be acknowledged by the very people it served. While Alice is still on her knees in the entrance hall, a second and equally urgent crisis is unfolding a few doors away, the small, windowless boot room off the gunroom passage, where Sam, the hallboy, has just been handed the first of what will eventually be more than 30 pairs of soaked leather boots. 5 gentlemen wear hunting boots and dress boots both, and their valets, where they have brought one, have already begun stripping off the ruined footwear and depositing it, without much ceremony, on the boot-room floor. Add to that the estate's own gamekeeper, 2 of the beaters who've come in to warm themselves before the walk back to the village, and Sir Edward's own everyday boots on top of his shooting pair, and Sam is looking at a pile of leather that would take a grown man the better part of an afternoon to properly restore. On a day when the household needs it restored, within a couple of hours. The comfortable version of boot cleaning, the one that survives in illustrations of a boy cheerfully buffing a single gleaming pair by a warm fire, has almost nothing in common with what Sam is actually doing. Wet leather does not simply need wiping down. It needs to be scraped clean of mud and grit with a blunt knife or a stiff brush, worked over while still damp, because dried mud pulls the finish off leather when it is finally removed, then dried slowly and carefully, never in front of an open flame, which would crack and warp the leather within a season, and finally treated with dubbin, a thick, greasy compound of tallow, wax, and oil that Sam works into the leather by hand to keep it from stiffening as it dries, and to restore some measure of waterproofing before it is worn out into the wet again. Only after all of that is finished does the actual blacking begin, a mixture in this period typically built from lampblack or soot-bound with beeswax or animal fat worked into the surface and then buffed to a shine with a hard brush, finally soft cloth. A process the historian Pamela Sambrook has catalogued in close detail as one of the most physically repetitive and chemically unpleasant tasks assigned to junior male servants in a country house of this size. Sam's hands by early afternoon are black to the wrist, with a combination of mud, dubbing grease, and blacking that no amount of washing between pairs will fully remove, and the smell of the boot room, tallow and soot and wet leather and horse is thick enough that he has stopped noticing it. The way a person stops noticing any smell they are sealed inside of for hours at a time. He works without a fire in the room, since an open flame near this much grease and leather dust is considered too great a risk, which means his own fingers are as cold and cramped as Alice's, gripping a boot brush instead of a scrub brush, but suffering something close to the same numbness by the time he reaches the 10th pair. He does not complain, and it would not occur to him that complaining was an option available to a 13-year-old hall boy in his position. What occurs to him instead, repeatedly, over the course of that long afternoon, is the practical fact that Sir Edward will want his second pair of boots by 4 o'clock for the walk down to inspect the kennels, regardless of whether the rain has stopped. And that fact organizes every minute of Sam's remaining day more completely than any instruction Mrs. Pangber, Garrow or Mr. Hedges could give him directly. The broader context behind this scene reaches back into a set of very specific, deliberate decisions the Victorian leather and shoemaking trades had made decades earlier. Waterproof rubber footwear existed by 1880, but it was expensive, uncomfortable for long walking, and considered unsuitable for anyone who wanted to look properly dressed rather than merely dry, which meant that gentlemen of Sir Edward's class continued to wear fine leather boots into exactly the kind of weather leather boots handle worst, and continue to expect those boots restored to presentable condition afterward, as though the weather had never touched them. The logic was practical in its own narrow way. Leather that received proper dubbin treatment after a soaking could last for years rather than months, and a household with a hall boy to spare could absorb the labor of that treatment at essentially no additional cost beyond the boy's modest wage and the grease itself. The entire arrangement depended on the assumption, rarely stated because it did not need to be, that a junior servant's hours were considerably cheaper than a pair of good boots, and that his hands, unlike the leather, required no particular maintenance to keep functioning at the same rate tomorrow. There is a specific kind of quiet in the boot room that afternoon, different from the brisk, watched activity of the entrance hall, where Alice works in full view of arriving guests. Nobody comes to check on Sam's progress except Mr. Sand Hedges, briefly, near 3 o'clock, to confirm the second pair of boots will be ready in time. For the most part, he works alone in a windowless room, with 30 pairs of ruined leather for company. The isolation of it, more than the cold, or the smell, or the ache building in his forearms, is the detail that tends to surprise people most when they hear how this job actually worked. The picture of a cheerful boy whistling over a single boot by the fire has almost nothing in common with a 13-year-old locked into hours of solitary, repetitive, chemically harsh labor in a windowless back room, doing work that had to be finished by a fixed hour. By 1:30, the entrance hall is clean enough to satisfy Mrs. Garrow, and Alice's next task is waiting for her, before she has even had a chance to dry her hand. 5 soaked, shivering house guests are upstairs in their rooms, wanting to wash off the worst of them all and change into dry clothes before luncheon. In a house like Ashcombe Hall in 1880, that means hot water, a great deal of it carried up by hand. The comfortable image people tend to hold of Victorian washing is a porcelain jug and basin sitting decoratively on a washstand, filled once in the morning and left there for the day, which is roughly accurate for an ordinary Tuesday, but nowhere close to what a soaked and freezing gentleman actually wanted after 4 hours on the moor. He wanted water hot enough to feel on contact, and he wanted it now. And he wanted it in a quantity well beyond what a single jug could hold. Indoor plumbing that delivered hot water directly to a bedroom remained rare even in comfortable country houses at this date. A handful of the grandest new-built estates in England had begun installing pipe bathrooms by 1880, but Ashcombe Hall, like the great majority of gentry houses of its size, still relied entirely on water heated in the kitchen range and carried up by hand in cans, exactly as it had for the previous 100 years. The can itself, a tall, cylindrical vessel of copper or Japan tin, with a narrow spout and a hinged lid to slow the heat loss, held somewhere around 2 to 3 gallons when full, which put its weight, water included, at over 20 pounds more once you accounted for the metal of the can. Alice would carry 2 at a time, one in each hand, up the back stairs, narrow, steep, uncarpeted staircase, built deliberately separate from the wide, carpeted front stairs the family and guests used so that a servant hauling steaming cans of water never had to be seen doing it by anyone she was serving. The back stairs at Ashcombe Hall climbed 4 full flights from the kitchen passage to the guest bedroom corridor, and on an ordinary day, Alice might make that climb, loaded, a dozen times before dinner. On this particular Tuesday, with 5 soaked guests all wanting to wash at once, instead of in the usual staggered morning rhythm, the number very nearly doubles, and it has to happen fast enough that the water is still properly hot by the time it reaches the top. Because heat bleeds out of an uninsulated metal can shockingly quickly in a cold stone stairwell, and a guest handed lukewarm water after 4 flights of climbing was the kind of complaint that reached Mrs. Garrow's ears by dinner. The physical mechanics of the job were unforgiving in ways that rarely make it into fiction. A full can, gripped by its handle, presses a thin metal edge into the same few inches of palm, and fingers trip after trip, and the historian Ruth Goodman, describing her own attempts to replicate this work for a television production, has written about how quickly that repeated pressure, steam rising off the open top of a can, scalds forearms on a regular basis, particularly on a staircase with a turn in it, where a maid has to twist her body without spilling. And because the water had to arrive close to boiling to still feel adequately hot after the climb, a slip on a wet stone step, made wetter still by the rain everyone had tracked in earlier that day, carried a real risk of serious burns rather than simply a ruined afternoon. Domestic accident reports and hospital admission records from the period, cited by several historians of Victorian service, including Frank Dawes, note scalding as one of the most common injuries suffered by young housemaids, was precisely the kind of day those injuries tended to happen. For Alice, specifically, this stretch of the afternoon is less about any single dramatic mishap than about simple, grinding repetition under pressure. She fills 2 cans in the scullery from water kept near boiling on the range, wraps a cloth around each handle to spare her palms as much as the cloth allows, climbs 4 flights, delivers the water, apologizes if it has cooled more than the guest would like, and descends again to refill, over and over, while also still expected to answer the housemaid's bell if it rings, and to keep an eye on the fires she lit that morning in case any of them need feeding. Her arms ache in a specific deep way by the 4th trip, not the sharp ache of a single effort, but the dull, accumulating ache of a muscle asked to repeat the same motion without adequate rest between repetitions. And her lower back, already tender from the morning's kneeling, tightens further with every flight of stairs taken at the pace misses. Garrow expects. What this reveals, set against the picture upstairs of grateful guests, simply relieved to be warm and dry again, is how completely the sensation of comfort experienced by one person in this house depended on manual, repeated, physically costly labor performed by another. Nobody upstairs washing off the moor in pleasantly hot water gave a moment's thought to the 4 flights of stairs that water had just traveled, or to the particular ache building in the arms of the girl who carried it, because the entire design of the system, backstairs, hinged lids, cloth-wrapped handles, and all, existed to make that labor as close to invisible as physically possible. The water simply arrived, hot, exactly when it was wanted, the way water from a modern tap arrives without anyone thinking about the treatment plant or the pipes behind the wall. The difference in 1880 is that the pipe was a 16-year-old girl, and she felt every single trip in her body by the end of the day. Rain, meanwhile, was quietly reorganizing the entire fuel economy of the house. And this is the part of a wet Victorian day that almost never makes it into the cozy version of the story, because a fire is exactly the detail that makes the cozy version feel true. Picture the country house rainy day as it usually gets imagined, and there is, almost without exception, a fire in it, generous, crackling, and apparently self-sustaining, the kind of fire that simply exists in the background of the scene. Nobody in that picture asks where the coal came from, who carried it, or how many times a day the fire had to be fed to keep burning at that size. The actual answer, on a day like this one, was considerably more coal than usual, delivered considerably more often because rain changed the household's behavior in ways that all pointed toward burning more fuel rather than less. Guests who would ordinarily have been out riding or walking for half the day were instead sitting in the library, the morning room, and their own bedrooms, which meant fires had to be kept going in 3 or 4 rooms simultaneously rather than 1 or 2. Wet clothing hung near open grates to encourage drying pulled additional heat out of every fire it hung beside. And the stone and brick fabric of a large country house, never especially good at holding warmth to begin with, grew noticeably colder and damper on a day of sustained rain, which meant every fire in the building needed feeding more frequently just to hold its usual output against the creeping chill coming through the walls. Pamela Sambrook's research into country house staffing puts a specific figure on this kind of labor, noting that in many households, a general servant or odd man was employed for no other purpose than hauling coal and logs from the yard to every fire in the house. Tough description that existed because the volume of fuel a large house consumed on a cold or wet day was simply too great for any other servant to fit into their existing duties. At Ashcombe Hall, that role belongs partly to the odd man, a stooped, taciturn fellow named Barrow who has worked the estate for 30 years, and partly on an especially demanding day to whichever housemaid or hallboy can be spared from other work. The coal itself is kept in a store built into the side of the service yard, accessible only from outside, which means that refilling the household scuttles on a day like this one requires walking directly out into the rain. Filling a heavy metal scuttle by hand from a diminishing pile of coal that itself grows slick and treacherous underfoot as the yard turns to mud, and carrying that scuttle, now considerably heavier for the coal dust turned briefly to paste on its surface. Barrow makes this trip perhaps 30 times over the course of the day. Each scuttle holds close to half a hundredweight when full, a weight that presses a groove into the palm through even a gloved hand. And by mid-afternoon, his shoulders have taken on the particular forward set that decades of this exact motion produce in a man's body, visible in old photographs of estate workers from this era to anyone who knows to look for it. Alice's portion of the coal work is smaller than Barrow's, but no less relentless. Between her trips carrying hot water, she is expected to keep the fires in the rooms under her direct care fed and tidy, which means carrying smaller loads up the same back stairs. Kneeling at each grate to clear ash, lay fresh coal, and coax the fire back to a presentable blaze without leaving visible soot on the hearthstone or her own hands. A standard nearly impossible to meet given the material she is working with. This is not a detail most people know, and it changes the picture entirely once you sit with it. Keeping a Victorian fire looking effortlessly cheerful required a servant to handle a thoroughly filthy substance, coal dust that blackens everything it touches, and then present herself and the room both as though no such substance had ever been anywhere near either of them. Soot under the fingernails had to be scrubbed away before serving at table. A streak of ash on an apron had to be changed before it was seen. The performance of a house that simply magically stayed warm depended on an unbroken chain of small acts of concealment that Alice performed dozens of times a day without anyone above stairs ever being asked to think about them. The historian Judith Flanders, writing about the physical infrastructure of the 19th century English home, has described coal as the single most labor-intensive substance a Victorian household depended on, more demanding in terms of raw hours of human effort than food, water, or even laundry. Because, unlike those other necessities, coal had to be handled constantly, hour by hour, all day, in every season, with no possibility of preparing a supply in advance, the way a cook might prepare food ahead of a busy evening. A wet day simply concentrated that ordinary year-round burden into a shorter, more frantic stretch of hours, doubling the number of fires needing attention while doing nothing whatsoever to lighten any of Alice's other tasks in the meantime. By late afternoon, her hands carry a permanent grey tinge along the creases of her knuckles that no amount of scrubbing before dinner service will fully lift, the kind of ingrained discoloration that period writers occasionally referred to, with a certain grim humour, as a housemaid's second set of gloves. It was, in its own small way, a badge of the day's actual content, worn on skin that was never supposed to be looked at closely enough for anyone to notice. If the mud and the coal and the endless trips up the back stairs describe the visible chaos of a wet day at Ashcombe Hall, the laundry room describes something closer to its slow, simmering catastrophe, and by mid-afternoon it has become the worst room in the house to stand in for more than a few minutes at a stretch. This is where Ivy Marsh, the laundry maid, has been fighting a losing battle since the shooting party first came in, soaked to the skin. And it is worth pausing on her work specifically, because it illustrates a problem that coal and mud and hot water do not. The problem of heavy Victorian wool that has absolutely nowhere to go once it is wet. The common assumption about laundry in a grand house is that it was simply a larger version of ordinary domestic washing. More garments, more staff, but fundamentally the same task performed at scale. That assumption collapses almost immediately once you consider what a rainy shooting day actually produced. 5 tweed hunting coats, 5 pairs of thick wool breeches, assorted wool waistcoats and mufflers, and Lady Vane's own outdoor cloak, all soaked through with rainwater rather than the ordinary sweat and dust of daily wear, arrived in the laundry room within the same hour, and wool in this condition behaves nothing like a wet cotton shirt. A single sodden tweed coat, by the estimates of textile historians who have studied period fabric weights, could hold several additional pounds of water beyond its dry weight, water that had worked its way deep into the fibers rather than sitting on the surface. And that water does not release itself quickly, no matter how it is handled. It has to be coaxed out, slowly, with heat and moving air, over many hours, sometimes days. The trouble was that Ashcombe Hall, like nearly every country house of its era, had no mechanical way to produce heat and moving air together except the very same coal fires already stretched thin across the rest of the building. Outdoor drying. The obvious solution on a fine day was obviously useless on a day when the rain had not stopped since before dawn. Ivy's actual tool for this crisis was a wooden clothes airer, a wide rack of slatted pine bars, raised and lowered on ropes, and a pulley fixed to the laundry room ceiling, hoisted up close to the rafters where the rising warmth from the room's own drying stove collected. It was a clever piece of equipment, the same basic design still sold today, under names like the Sheila Maid. And it worked, after a fashion, provided you did not need it to work quickly, and did not mind what it did to the room underneath it. What it did to the room was turn it, within a couple of hours, into something closer to a steam bath than a workroom. Water driven out of heavy wool by heat has to go somewhere, and in an enclosed room with a low ceiling and no ventilation beyond a single small window kept shut against the weather, it condensed on every cold surface it touched: the stone walls, the underside of the rafters, Ivy's own hair, and the fabric of her own dress. The air in the laundry room by 3 o'clock that afternoon was thick enough to feel on the skin, warm and wet, in a way that never quite resolved into either genuine warmth or genuine dryness. And it carried a smell, wet sheep's wool being an intensely organic material that releases its own particular odor when heated and damped in close succession, something between a farmyard and a wet dog that no amount of lavender water sprinkled around the room ever fully disguised. Ivy has worked in conditions close to this one for 6 years, and the toll it has taken on her is not the kind of injury that shows up in a single dramatic moment. It shows up as a persistent wet cough that worsens every autumn and improves slightly every summer, and as a chest that catches painfully in cold air after a day spent breathing warm saturated steam. Physicians of the period, and later historians working from parish burial records and workhouse infirmary logs, documented laundry work as one of the domestic trades most reliably associated with chronic respiratory illness. The constant cycling between damp heat inside the laundry and cold drafts in the corridors outside it, creating exactly the conditions in which lung complaints took hold and never fully cleared. Ivy does not think of her cough as an occupational illness in any formal sense. She thinks of it, when she thinks of it at all, as simply part of what the job costs, the way a blacksmith expects his hearing to go, or a seamstress expects her eyes to weaken. Nobody has ever suggested to her that it might be otherwise. Alice passes through the laundry room twice that afternoon, once delivering an extra armful of linen and once retrieving dry cloths for the entrance hall. And both times she notices, without really examining the thought, how much worse the air feels each time compared to her own domain of cold stone floors and colder stairwells. The two young women exchange a few brief business-like words each time, Ivy asking after the state of things upstairs, Alice reporting that the gentlemen have not stopped complaining about the weather since they came in. Both of them laughing quietly at the particular unfairness of 5 grown men treating a wet afternoon as a personal misfortune, while the actual misfortune unfolds 2 floors below their notice. The wool itself, in the end, does not fully dry. By the time the household sits down to dinner that evening, the hunting coats are damp rather than sodden wearable again, in a strict sense, but nowhere close to properly dry, and Ivy already knows she will be back at the era first thing the following morning, coaxing the last of the moisture out before the coats are wanted again for whatever the next day happens to bring. There is no such thing, in a house like Ashcombe Hall on a day like this one, as laundry that gets finished. There is only laundry that gets handed off, still slightly unresolved, to the next available hour of somebody's working day. By 4 in the afternoon, the house has developed a smell, and it is worth spending some time on this specifically, because smell is one of the details period dramas and pastel illustrations of Victorian domestic life leave out almost entirely, for the simple reason that a screen cannot transmit it, and a painting was never asked to. A rainy day sealed the house like Ashcombe Hall shut in a way a fine day never did. Windows that might otherwise have been cracked open to air out a room stayed firmly closed against the wet, and the result, over the course of a single wet Tuesday, was an atmosphere that thickened steadily from morning to evening, with almost nowhere for any of it to escape. 6 or 7 hunting dogs, let in soaked and unbrushed, never fully dried before being allowed back into the boot room and the passages near the kitchen, contributed the first and most obvious layer, the thick, unmistakable smell of wet dog that clings to stone floors and wool rugs for hours after the animal responsible has moved on. Coal smoke added a second layer, present every day in some measure, but considerably heavier on a day when every grate in the house was being fed more often and more urgently than usual, drifting through chimneys that occasionally backed a little in wet, heavy air and pushed a faint sourness into the rooms nearest the flues. The laundry room's contribution, the warm, damp, faintly farmyard smell of heated, wet wool, seeped out along the back passage every time Ivy opened the door to hang another load and mixed in the narrow servants' corridor connecting the kitchen to the rest of the house, with the tallow candles still used to light that corridor after dark. Since the household's newer paraffin lamps and gas fittings had been installed only in the rooms the family actually used, tallow, rendered animal fat, burns with a smell period writers described bluntly and without affection, and in a badly ventilated back passage on a day already thick with wet wool and wet dog, it did nothing to improve the atmosphere. Damp wool, chilled marrow, unending labor. It is a fair, three-part summary of what a wet day at Ashcombe Hall actually amounted to for the people working through it. And the smell was simply the most immediate, least escapable expression of all three at once. A physical fact the household's below-stairs staff could not step away from even for a moment. Because stepping away meant abandoning whichever task currently required them. The family upstairs experienced almost none of this directly. And the reason is architectural as much as anything else. The green baize door separating the service passages from the family's part of the house existed originally to muffle sound, the clatter of trays and the raised voices of a busy kitchen, but it did nearly as much to contain smell, a heavy, tightly fitted door that sealed the working half of the house away from the half where people sat and read and drank tea. Lady Vane's own sitting room, on the far side of that door, and up a full flight of the grand staircase besides, carried instead the scent of beeswax furniture polish, dried lavender kept in small linen sachets tucked into drawers and cushions, and the clean resinous smell of the applewood. Mrs. Hand, Garrow specifically requested, be burned in the family's grates rather than the ordinary coal used everywhere else in the house. A small, deliberate extravagance that existed for exactly this reason. For Alice, the smell was not something she could retreat from because her work required her to move constantly between the two worlds, from the wet dog and tallow of the back passage to the lavender and beeswax of the family's rooms, carrying coal scuttles and hot water cans across that boundary. Each crossing required a kind of instant, practice recalibration, not of her sense of smell, which had little choice but to simply endure both atmospheres in turn, but of her bearing, her expression, and the state of her hands and apron. Since arriving in Lady Vane's sitting room, carrying so much as a trace, the boot room's tallow and grease on her clothing would have been noticed immediately and unfavorably. She kept a second, cleaner apron for exactly this purpose, changed several times over the course of the afternoon in a cramped linen closet just inside the green baize door, a small, unglamorous ritual that existed entirely, that the two smells of the house never had reason to meet in the same room at the same time. Historians who study the sensory experience of the Victorian era, among them Lee Jackson, who has written at length about how carefully 19th century England policed the boundary between acceptable and unacceptable smells, have noted how directly smell functioned as a marker of social position in this period. A gentleman's nose, in the era's own understanding of itself, was simply more delicate than a labourer's, more easily offended, more in need of protection from the ordinary odours of physical work, and an entire domestic architecture, doors, corridors, separate staircases, existed in part to preserve that supposed delicacy from ever actually being tested. Whether Sir Edward's nose was actually any more sensitive than Alice's is not a question anyone in 1880 thought worth asking. What mattered was that his rooms smelled of applewood and lavender, and that the machinery required to keep it that way doubled in urgency by the rain, remained safely and permanently on the other side of a door covered in green baize. There is a version of the English country house that exists almost entirely above ground in the popular imagination. A building of tall windows, wide lawns, and gracious rooms flooded with whatever light the weather allows. It is worth remembering, on a day like this one, that a house like Ashcombe Hall was not actually built that way. It was built with an entire working world folded beneath and behind the visible one. A service wing set partly below grade, its floor sunk several feet under the level of the lawns outside, so that the kitchen, the sculleries, the servants' hall, and the storerooms received what light they got through narrow windows set high in the wall, at or near ground level, rather than through anything a person upstairs would recognize as a proper window. On a dry day, this arrangement was merely gloomy. On a day of sustained rain, it became something closer to a slow siege. Groundwater rose against the foundation walls of the service wing, the same clay-heavy Shropshire soil that had coated the shooting party's boots that morning held water close against the stone for hours after the rain itself had passed, seeping through old mortar joints, a process too slow to notice from one hour to the next, but entirely obvious to anyone who had worked in those rooms for more than a season. Garrow kept a running informal inventory of which corners of which storerooms tended to dampen. First, in weather like this, knowledge passed down from housekeeper to housekeeper the way a farmer learns which fields flood, because nobody had ever built the service wing with a formal solution to the problem. They had simply built it, accepted that dampness was part of what came with a below-grade kitchen, and managed the consequences as they arose. Those consequences, on this particular Tuesday, showed up first in the dry goods store, where a sack of flour kept too close to the outer wall had begun to feel faintly cool and slightly tacky to the touch by late afternoon, an early warning sign of the mold that would bloom across its surface within another day or two if it was not moved. They showed up in the linen room as well, where sheets and pillowcases stored in a chest against the same outer wall carried a faint, musty edge to their smell that no amount of the dried lavender tucked between the folds ever fully counted. An edge experienced housekeepers learned to catch early, because linen that sat damp for too long developed spots of mildew that no laundering afterward could fully remove. Pamela Sambrook's research into the physical layout of country house service wings has documented this exact pattern across dozens of surviving estates, noting how consistently basement and semi-basement storage areas struggled with damp, regardless of the wealth or grandeur of the family living above them. Since the problem was structural, rather than a matter of insufficient funds or insufficient care, Alice's specific errand into this part of the house that afternoon is a short one, carrying a fresh supply of dry cloths down to the linen room at Mrs. Deemer. Garrow's instruction, but the cold that meets her the moment she descends the last few steps from the kitchen passage is different in character from the cold everywhere else in the house. It is a cold with weight to it, heavy and mineral, the particular chill of stone that has never once, in living memory, been properly warmed, since no fire was ever laid in a storeroom that existed purely for the storage of dry goods and linen, rather than for anyone to sit in. She does not linger. Nobody who worked in that part of the house lingered longer than the task required, not out of any specific fear, but out of the same practical instinct that kept a person from lingering in any cold, damp place when warmer air was available a short walk away. What made this particular hazard difficult to fully solve, even for a household with money to spend, was that the same architectural logic that put stone floors in the entrance hall for easy scrubbing also put the service wing partly underground, tucked discreetly out of the sightline of anyone approaching the house from the drive or strolling the lawns. Judith Flanders has written about how thoroughly Victorian domestic architecture prioritized the visual experience of the family and their guests over the working conditions of the staff maintaining that experience, a house designed quite literally from the outside in, with the service quarters occupying whatever space was left over once the family's rooms had claimed the best light, the best air, and the highest ground. A below-grade kitchen with damp storerooms was not a design failure by the standards the house was actually built to. It was a reasonable trade the architect and the family had made, mostly without discussing it directly, between the visible grandeur of the rooms upstairs and the working conditions of the rooms below, and the trade had been made overwhelmingly at the expense of people like Alice and Ivy Garrow, who spent the greater part of every day inside the consequences of it. There is a quiet observation worth making here, one that recurs across nearly every physical detail of this particular Tuesday. The family upstairs experienced dampness, if they experienced it at all, as something faintly poetic, the sound of rain on glass, the smell of wet earth through a cracked window in the conservatory. Below stairs, dampness was a material problem with real consequences. Spoiled flour, mildewed linen, a chill that worked its way into a person's joints over years of exposure, and it was managed not through architecture or investment, but through the constant, glamorous vigilance of people whose job it was to notice a slightly tacky sack of flour before it became a ruined one. The house did not solve its own dampness. It simply assigned the problem to someone, and that someone, more often than not, was a girl of 16 carrying an armful of dry cloths down a flight of stairs that never once, in all the years the house had stood, felt warm beneath her feet. Sometime around 9 in the evening, once the family and their guests have finally gone into dinner, and the worst of the day's visible crisis has passed, Alice climbs the 4 flights of the back stairs one last time, not carrying anything now, simply climbing them in her own tired body, to the attic room she shares with 2 other maids under the very roof of Ashcombe Hall. It is the one part of this story that a comfortable imagination might assume offers some relief, a chance, finally, to be warm and still after a day spent cold and moving. It does not. Country house attics were built, almost without exception, purely as storage and servant accommodation, spaces the architect fit in wherever the roofline allowed, rather than spaces designed with any particular comfort in mind. The single detail that mattered most on a night like this one was the complete absence of any fireplace at all in Alice's room or in either of the 2 rooms beside it. The chimneys, serving the family's bedrooms 2 floors below, ran up through the walls near enough to share some faint residual warmth on a good night. But on a night of driving, sustained rain, with wind pushing directly against the exposed slates and dormers of the roof, that faint warmth did nothing to counter the cold radiating in from every surface around her. The rain itself found its way in as well, not as an obvious leak, but as a persistent damp that cracked into the plaster near the eaves, so that the wall behind Alice's narrow iron bed carried a faint chill dampness of its own, distinct from the cold, dry air of the room. Her dampness her blanket brushed against every time she turned in her sleep. She shares the room with 2 other maids, Bess and a girl newer to service than either of them named Rachel, and the 3 of them undress quickly in the near dark, since a single candle stub is all misses. Garrow allows for the attic, and none of them wants to waste it on a night when they are all simply desperate to lie down. Their nightclothes are dry at least, kept in a small chest well away from the damp wall, but the sheets themselves carry a faint, chill dampness that never fully leaves them during the wetter months of the year, since a bed that is never warmed by any fire nearby has no real mechanism for drying out fully between one use and the next. Bess has taken to sleeping in an old shawl wrapped around her shoulders on nights like this one, a habit the other two have started copying. Less for warmth in any real sense than for the thin psychological comfort of an extra layer between her skin and sheets that never feel entirely dry. This is not a detail most people know about Victorian servant life, and it changes the picture considerably once you actually sit with it. The ordinary, unremarkable reality that the people responsible for keeping a great house warm and dry slept, night after night, the coldest and dampest rooms that house contained. It was not cruelty in any deliberate sense. It was simply the bottom of a very old hierarchy of comfort, in which heat, like everything else in the household, flowed downward from the family's rooms and never quite reached all the way to the top of the building where the people who produced that heat actually slept. The medical consequences of this arrangement were well understood by physicians of the period, even if nobody organized around fixing them. Rheumatism, a broad Victorian term covering what modern medicine would separate into several distinct joint and muscle conditions, was recognized as an occupational hazard of domestic service, specifically because servants spent their working hours moving between extremes, hot kitchens and cold sculleries, steaming laundry rooms and freezing backstairs, and then slept every night in rooms that offered no recovery from any of it. Chilblains, already a feature of Alice's daily hands and feet, worsened reliably during exactly this kind of prolonged, damp, cold, and a persistent cough, the kind Ivy carried down in the laundry room, could just as easily take hold in a servant who had never set foot in that room. Simply from sleeping night after night in damp bedding in an unheated attic through an English autumn and winter. The diaries of Hannah Colwick, a real Victorian maid of all work whose daily journal entries were later collected and edited by the historian Liz Stanley, offer some of the clearest surviving evidence of exactly this pattern from a servant's own hand. Colwick's entries, kept across household after household in the middle decades of the century, record in exhausting, matter-of-fact detail the boots blacked, the grates cleaned, the floors scrubbed, and the coal carried, that filled her days, along with the accumulated physical cost of it, sore hands, aching knees, and a body she describes again and again, simply getting on with the next task, regardless of how it felt. Nothing in her diary suggests she considered any this remarkable. It was, for a servant of her rank in this period, simply what a working life consisted of, day after day, in whatever household happened to employ her. Alice falls asleep quickly despite the cold, less from any particular comfort than from sheer exhaustion. The specific, dreamless sleep of a body that has spent 16 hours in near constant motion and has nothing left to spend on anything as optional as staying awake. Somewhere below her, 2 floors down, and on the far side of walls thick enough to hold real heat, Lady Vane is climbing into a bed warmed an hour earlier by a hot water bottle, another maid carried up specifically for that purpose. In a room where a small fire still glows in the grate and will be quietly fed again before midnight by whichever housemaid holds that particular duty tonight. The distance between those 2 beds, in a physical sense, is perhaps 40 feet of staircase. In every other sense that mattered to how the night actually felt in each of them, it was considerably further than that. Underneath every single task described so far, the mud, the boots, the water, the coal, the wool, the damp, sat one further requirement that made all of it considerably harder than the physical labor alone would suggest, and that requirement was invisibility itself. It is easy, from a comfortable distance of a century and a half, to focus on the sheer volume of work a rainy day generated at a house like Ashcombe Hall and miss the additional, purely psychological demand layered on top of it, the strict expectation that none of this labor, frantic and exhausting as it so often was ever to be visibly performed in front of the family or their guests. The architecture of the house existed specifically to make this possible. Backstairs, narrow and uncarpeted, ran parallel to the grand front staircase, precisely so that a servant carrying coal or water or an armful of dirty linen never needed to cross paths with anyone she served. Service passages connected the kitchen to the dining room by a hidden roundabout route rather than a direct one, so that food could travel from range to table without a guest ever glimpsing the kitchen itself. And where the architecture failed, where a servant and a family member did happen to meet unexpectedly in a corridor or on a landing, etiquette itself supplied the missing wall. Housemaids at Ashcombe Hall, like housemaids across the country, were trained to turn and face the wall, or to withdraw quickly into whatever doorway or alcove happened to be nearest, whenever a member of the family approached, a small, practiced gesture of self-erasure that servants performed so many times over the course of a career that it stopped registering to them as anything unusual at all. On an ordinary day, this system worked smoothly enough, since the household's usual rhythm gave everyone below stairs a reasonably predictable sense of where the family would be and when. A rainy day like this, one broke that predictability apart entirely. The shooting party's early unexpected return meant guests and family members were moving through parts of the house, and at times of day when the servants working there had not planned to need to disappear. Alice, mid-scrub on the entrance hall floor when the party first arrived, had to rise quickly, bucket and brush in hand, and press herself into the recessed doorway of the cloakroom, while 5 wet gentlemen tracked past her, an interruption that cost her nearly 2 minutes of the very task she was already racing to finish before the mud set into the stone. She would repeat some version of that same maneuver a dozen more times before the day was over, flattening against a wall on the back stairs when Miss Pruitt came down unexpectedly for extra towels, ducking into the linen closet when Lady Vane herself, restless after being cooped up indoors all afternoon, decided to take an unscheduled turn through the upstairs corridor to see how the weather looked from a different window. Footmen bore a particular version of this same burden, one worth noting on its own, because their invisibility had to be maintained even while they were directly and visibly serving the family, which meant it could not rely on simply disappearing from view the way a housemaid could. Walter, one of the 2 footmen at Ashcombe Hall, had spent a soaked half-hour that afternoon helping carry the shooting party's guns, game bags, and sodden outer coats in from the stable yard, and by the time he was needed at the drawing-room door to announce that tea had been laid, his own livery, carefully brushed and pressed that morning, carried a faint, unmistakable dampness through the shoulders that no amount of standing near a fire beforehand had fully dried. He served that afternoon's tea with the same upright, unhurried composure he brought to every other afternoon, giving no outward sign whatsoever that he had spent the previous half-hour soaked through in a stable yard, because a footman who appeared flustered, cold, or in any way affected by his own physical circumstances had failed at the single most important part of his job. The performance required of him was not simply competence. It was the appearance of a body entirely unbothered by conditions that had, in fact, thoroughly bothered it. The logic behind all of this, however strange it looks from the present, was practical within the terms the era set for itself. A household paid handsomely, relative to what a servant earned, for the specific illusion that its comfort arose naturally, without visible mechanism or visible cost. And any servant caught looking cold, wet, harried, or simply present at the wrong moment undermined that illusion directly, regardless of how well she had actually done the underlying work. Etiquette manuals and household guides of the period were explicit about this expectation in ways that read today as almost startlingly direct. A good servant, in the language these manuals used repeatedly, was one whose work was felt but never seen, whose presence in a room registered only through the state the room was left in, rather than through any awareness of the person who had left it that way. Mrs. Byton's own household manual, the closest thing this period had to a universal domestic reference, reinforced this expectation across its instructions for nearly every category of servant, treating quiet, unobtrusive movement not as a pleasant bonus, but as one of the basic, non-negotiable qualifications for the job. What this meant, in practice, on a day of genuine crisis like this one, was that the household staff carried 2 full-time jobs simultaneously rather than one. The first job was the actual physical labor, scrubbing, carrying, blacking, drying, that the weather had already doubled. The second, running underneath the first at every moment, was the constant, vigilant management of when and where that labor could safely be seen. Form of work that left no visible trace of its own and therefore has almost entirely vanished from the historical record. N4, or a stray comment preserved in a household account book, lets a modern reader glimpse how much additional effort a servant spent simply managing her own visibility on top of everything else expected of her. There is a particular kind of exhaustion in this that does not show up in an aching back or a chapped hand, though Alice has both of those too by the end of the day. It is the exhaustion of never for 1 full minute between 5 in the morning and 9:30 at night being permitted to simply exist in a room the way the people she served were permitted to exist in it, without calculation, without a plan for disappearing, without one part of her attention forever held in reserve for the sound of an approaching footstep on the other side of a door. The comfortable assumption about a day like this one is that its worst hour was also its last, that once the mud was scrubbed, the boots blacked, and the guests dried, changed, and settled in front of the drawing-room fire again, the crisis passed, and the household's rhythm returned to something like normal. Rain, however, does not observe a household's preferred schedule for when its consequences are allowed to end. And at Ashcombe Hall, the actual demands of this particular Tuesday continued for a good 6 hours after the family sat down to dinner in ways that never once interrupted the evening taking place 1 floor above. The wool that Ivy had coaxed to merely damp rather than sodden by late afternoon needed turning again after dinner, each garment rearranged on the drying rack so that the side that had faced the rafters all day, a task that could not simply wait until morning without risking mildew setting into fabric that had already spent most of a day in the exact warm, wet conditions mildew requires. Every fire in the house that had been built up to fight the day's damp needed banking properly before anyone could think about sleep, not merely left to burn down on its own, since a grate full of unattended coal in a house this old, with old timber in its floors and roof beams, was a genuine fire risk that no housekeeper worth her position would ignore simply because the day had already been exhausting enough. And the mud tracked across the entrance hall a second time that evening when 2 of the gentlemen decided, despite everything, to step out briefly to check on the dogs before retiring, meant Alice was back on her knees with the same bucket and the same brush well after 10 o'clock, scrubbing the same stretch of floor she had already scrubbed once that afternoon, because a floor that looked wrong at breakfast the next morning would reflect just as badly on the household as one that looked wrong at luncheon. None of this extra labor registered upstairs as anything unusual at all. Sir Edward and his guest, having spent a thoroughly disrupted afternoon indoors instead of at whatever activity the day had originally promised them, stayed up later than usual that evening, playing cards and talking by the fire well past the hour the household normally began winding down. Which meant the bells connected to the guest bedrooms rang later than usual too, each one summoning whichever maid was still on duty to bring up a final jug of water and extra coal for a bedroom fire, or simply to turn down a bed that had been expected to need turning down 2 hours earlier. The rain, in other words, had not merely doubled the day's labor during daylight hours. It had quietly extended the working day itself, pushing its final tasks later into the night, without anyone above stairs registering that an extension had taken place. Because from where they sat, the evening simply continued at its own comfortable pace, exactly as it always did. Alice's own day finally ends somewhere close to 11, nearly 2 hours past her usual hour for climbing to the attic, and the last exchange of it before she parts ways with Sam in the passage outside the boot room is a small one, hardly worth recording by the standards of anything that happened earlier that day. Sam, his hands still faintly stained despite a second scrubbing, holds up his blackened fingers in the low light of a single candle and asks her, in the flat, deadpan way, exhausted 13-year-olds sometimes manage better than adults do, whether she thinks the rain plans on doing this again tomorrow. Alice tells him she has no idea and that she has decided not to think about tomorrow until tomorrow actually arrives. And the two of them share a short, honestly tired laugh over it, the kind of laugh that exists less because anything was funny and more because laughing, briefly, was easier than not laughing. It is a small moment and it belongs entirely to them, unwitnessed by anyone upstairs and unrecorded in any account book or wage ledger. And it is very likely the closest thing either of them experiences that day to a moment that was theirs alone. Garrow, passing through the kitchen passage on her own final round of the night, checking that every fire has been properly banked and every door properly locked, pauses long enough to tell Alice briefly, and without much warmth in her voice, but without any real coldness either. A sentence Alice will turn over privately in her mind more than once as she finally climbs to the cold attic room, because compliments of any kind were rare enough in her working life that even a small, plainly spoken one carried a disproportionate weight. It does not warm the room. It does not dry the bedsheets or ease the ache in her knees. It simply exists, briefly, as a small and genuine acknowledgement from one exhausted woman to another that the day had been every bit as difficult as it felt, which was more acknowledgement than most days like this one ever received at all. By the time Alice finally lies down, the rain outside has begun to ease, thinning from the steady downpour that had defined the entire day into a lighter, more intermittent patter against the attic's small dormer window, the kind of sound that on a different night, in a different bed, might have been pleasant enough to fall asleep to. She is asleep within minutes regardless, too tired to register the sound as pleasant or unpleasant, or anything at all. And somewhere below her, the house itself settles into the particular quiet of a home whose fires have all finally been banked for the night, its floors clean, its boots blacked, its wool as dry as it is ever going to get before morning. Every visible trace of the day's actual difficulty erased so thoroughly that nothing about the house, seen fresh the next morning, will suggest that any of it happened at all. It is worth returning, for a moment, to the drawing room where this story began, because the contrast between what a rainy day actually cost and what it was permitted to feel like is nowhere clearer than in the complaints the family and their guests allowed themselves over the course of that same Tuesday. Their hardships were real to them in the modest, self-contained way that any inconvenience feels real to the person experiencing it, and setting those complaints directly alongside everything already described here is not an exercise in mockery. It is simply the clearest possible measure of how completely the household's labor had succeeded in shielding its most comfortable members from the actual weight of the day. Sir Edward's chief grievance, voiced more than once over luncheon, again at dinner, concerned the shooting itself, cut cruelly short by weather that had, in his words, made the whole exercise pointless well before noon. He was, by his own account, thoroughly put out by the whole affair, a phrase he used with a particular emphasis for a man for whom being thoroughly put out represented a genuine and significant misfortune. One of the lady guests, the same Miss Redfern seen playing cards near the window earlier that afternoon, complained gently to anyone who would listen about how tiresome it was to be confined indoors for an entire day, an observation she made while seated in a warm, well-lit room with a full tea service, a novel, and agreeable company. On an environment she nonetheless experienced, sincerely, as a form of mild deprivation. The older woman in dark green silk woke from her nap in time to remark that the damp weather always did something unfortunate to her joints, a complaint she offered, with no apparent awareness that the exact same weather had spent the day doing considerably worse things. Even Lady Vane, whose own afternoon this video opened by describing, allowed herself one small grievance over dinner, mentioning that her sitting room fire had seemed to need building up more often than usual that day, a passing observation offered as idle conversation rather than genuine concern. Always eventually been built back up, warm and cheerful, by the time she next wanted it. She had no reason to wonder why it kept needing attention, no occasion to learn that the same rain making her own fire slightly less reliable than usual was at that very moment the reason a 16-year-old girl had spent an unusual portion of her afternoon kneeling at that particular grate rather than at any of the others under her care. None of these complaints were dishonest, exactly, and it would be a mistake to read them as evidence of any particular callousness on the part of the people making them. Sir Edward genuinely had wanted to finish his day's shooting. Miss Redfern really did find an unplanned day indoors somewhat tedious. The entire arrangement of the household, its architecture, its staffing, its elaborate systems of back stairs and green baize doors, existed specifically to make sure that a member of the family never had reason to know just how much smaller their own hardship was compared to the one unfolding on the other side of every wall and door, building. Their complaints were not lies. They were simply complaints issued from inside a world carefully engineered to prevent anyone from making an accurate comparison. This is not a detail most people know, and it changes the picture considerably once you actually hold both versions of the day side by side. A guest mildly bored by an afternoon indoors, and a hallboy locked into hours of solitary, chemically harsh labor in a windowless room were experiencing the same storm, under the same roof, on the same date, and neither one had any real access to what the other's day actually contained. The household's entire design depended on maintaining exactly that gap, since a family, fully aware of what its comfort cost, in scrubbed knees and blistered palms and damp, unheated attic rooms, might have found that comfort considerably harder to enjoy. The historian Lucy Lethbridge, who has written extensively about the long, slow decline of live and domestic service across British history, has described this particular gap between an employing family's genuine ignorance of its servants' daily reality, present in wealthy households across the country, and largely unchanged from one decade to the next throughout the Victorian period. It was not that families like the Vanes were forbidden from knowing what a day like this one actually demanded of their staff. It was simply that nothing in the household's design, and very little in the wider culture surrounding it, ever gave them a reason to ask. It is worth asking, before stepping back to consider what all of this actually means, how much of it changed, and how quickly. Because the honest answer complicates any tidy assumption that progress arrived swiftly. Once the Victorian era ended. In 1880, when Alice climbed those back stairs for the last time that night, the basic technology available to a household like Ashcombe Hall for heating water, drying wool, and warming a room had not changed meaningfully in 100 years. Coal fires, hand-carried water, and unmechanized laundry remained the standard not because nobody had imagined an alternative, but because the alternatives that existed, piped hot water chief among them, remained expensive, unreliable, and largely confined to the newest and wealthiest houses being built at the very top of English society. Change, when it came, arrived slowly and unevenly, rather than all at once. Piped hot water and proper bathrooms spread gradually through country houses over the following few decades, so that a house like Ashcombe Hall might reasonably have installed its first fixed bathroom sometime in the 1890 seconds or early 1900 seconds, decades after the wealthiest London townhouses had already done so. And even then, the change tended to arrive one bathroom at a time, added for the family's use, long before any thought was given to whether the servants carrying water for it might benefit from the same convenience. Central heating, in any form recognizable today, remained essentially absent from British homes of every class, well into the 20th century. And the coal fire Alice tended that October afternoon in 1880 would still have been the primary heat source in a great many English houses, right up through the Second World War, and in some households considerably beyond it. The laundry itself took even longer to change in any fundamental way. Mechanical washing machines existed by the early 20th century, but remained rare and expensive for decades afterward, and it was not until the years after the Second World War that electric washing machines became a realistic household purchase for anyone outside the wealthiest families, with the tumble dryer, the single invention that would have solved Ivy's entire crisis in an afternoon, not becoming an ordinary feature of British homes until later still, well into the second half of the 20th century. For most of the intervening decades, the basic physical problem Ivy faced in that steamy, mold-prone laundry room, wet wool with nowhere convenient to dry, continued to exist in more or less the same form, simply performed by fewer live-in servants and more often by the woman of the house herself. Once domestic service, as an institution, began its long decline, that decline, when it finally arrived, came less from any change in household technology than from a change in who was available and willing to do this kind of work at all. The historian Lucy Lethbridge has traced how thoroughly the First World War reshaped the domestic labour market in Britain, pulling young women who might once have entered service as a matter of course into factory work, munitions production, and other paid employment that offered better wages, more independence, invisible surveillance, a live-in position demanded. Country houses across England struggled to find and keep staff throughout the 1920 seconds and 1930 seconds in a way that would have been unthinkable to a housekeeper like Mrs. Garrow in 1880, when a position at a well-run house like Ashcombe Hall, however hard the actual labour, still represented a genuine and sought-after improvement over the alternatives available to a working-class girl of 16. What this means is that the specific exhausting choreography described throughout this account, the mud, the boots, the coal, the water, the wool, and above all the constant unacknowledged labour of remaining invisible while performing all of it, did not end because anyone in a position of power decided it should. It ended gradually, unevenly, and largely as a side effect of broader economic and social changes that had very little to do with servants' welfare as such a specific goal. The washing machine and the central heating boiler that eventually made a day like Alice's obsolete were invented to sell convenience to a growing middle class, not to relieve the particular suffering of a 16-year-old tweenie with chapped hands and a permanent stoop in her back. That her suffering happened to be relieved along the way was, in a real sense, incidental to the actual motivation behind the change. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that a rainy day today, for most people reading or listening to this account, requires none of what it required at Ashcombe Hall in 1880. A furnace or a boiler somewhere in the building maintains a steady, even warmth without anyone climbing 4 flights of stairs to feed it by hand. A washing machine and a dryer resolve the problem of wet wool in an afternoon, unattended, without filling a single room with steam or mildew. Water arrives at whatever temperature is wanted through a pipe in the wall instantly, without a single copper can or a single flight of stairs involved anywhere in the process. The comfort Lady Vane enjoyed in 1880 required an entire hidden household of human labor to produce. The equivalent comfort available to nearly anyone today requires, for the most part, only the flip of a switch, and it is worth remembering. The next time rain settles against a window on an ordinary afternoon, exactly how recent and exactly how hard-won that particular kind of ease actually is. There is one more room in this story worth entering before stepping back from the day entirely, because it is easy, having followed the mud and the boots and the coal and the wool this far, to assume the kitchen itself was somehow exempt from all of it. A warm, well-lit room, where at least the cook and her scullery maid had the fire on their side rather than fighting it. The truth of the kitchen on a day like this one was considerably more complicated than that, and it deserves its own attention. The common assumption about a wet day and a country house kitchen is a reasonably sensible one. If the family is staying in rather than going out, meals presumably become simpler, since nobody has worked up the appetite a long ride or a day of shooting produces, and the kitchen, at least, stays dry and warm no matter what the weather does outside. Both halves of that assumption were wrong at Ashcombe Hall on this particular Tuesday, and Mrs. Yeoman, the cook, would have said so herself, in fairly blunt terms, if anyone had thought to ask her. Guests confined indoors for an entire day did not eat less. They ate considerably more, and considerably more often, since a full day with nowhere to be, and nothing much to do beyond cards and reading, tends to turn every meal and every gap between meals into an occasion. Luncheon that day ran longer and heavier than usual. Afternoon tea, ordinarily served once in the drawing room, had to be delivered twice, once at the normal hour and once again later when the card players called for a fresh pot, which meant an extra full tray, an extra pot boiled, an extra set of cups washed, dried, and returned to the cupboard on top of everything else already demanding attention that day. Dinner itself ran to more courses than Mrs. Yeoman had originally planned, since Sir Edward denied his usual day of exercise, had decided the household might as well make an occasion of the evening instead, a decision that arrived in the kitchen, an instruction rather than a request, and left Mrs. Past, Yeoman rearranging a menu already half prepared with barely 3 hours' notice. None of this extra cooking happened in a room genuinely insulated from the day's weather either. The kitchen range at Ashcombe Hall, the largest single source of heat in the entire service wing, ran hotter and longer on a day like this one than on almost any other, both because of the additional meals it needed to produce and because its steady heat was the only thing keeping the damp chill of the below-grade kitchen passage from creeping fully into bees. The room, that heat came at a cost of its own. The scullery maid, a girl younger even than Alice, named Peggy, spent most of the afternoon at a stone sink filled with water gone tepid within minutes of being drawn, scrubbing an unusually large volume of pots, pans, and serving dishes in a room thick with steam from the range and smoke from a chimney drawing poorly in the day's heavy, wet air. Her hands submerged in dirty water for hours at a stretch, while her back and shoulders bore the same accumulating strain Alice's did 2 floors above her. Mrs. Yeoman herself, presiding over all of it, worked that afternoon in a state the household simply called being put about, snapping orders more sharply than usual, sending Peggy back to rewash a pan that had not been properly dried, and losing, for a short, tense quarter hour around 4 o'clock, all patience whatsoever with a delivery boy who arrived late and soaked with a crate of vegetables that should have come hours earlier. It was not cruelty on her part, any more than it was on Sir Edward's when he complained about his ruined shooting. It was the specific, compounding pressure of a kitchen asked to produce considerably more food to a considerably tighter and more erratic schedule, with exactly the same number of hands it had been given to manage an ordinary day. The broader pattern here is a simple one, though it rarely gets mentioned in accounts of Victorian weather and its effects. Rain did not merely add discrete new tasks to specific rooms of the house, a bit more mud here, a bit more coal there. It reshaped the household's entire rhythm of demand. And nowhere did that reshaping land harder than in the kitchen, where every extra hour indoors upstairs translated directly into an extra tray, an extra course, an extra round of washing up below stairs. The family's boredom, harmless and even faintly pleasant from where they sat, arrived in the kitchen as pressure, and the kitchen absorbed that pressure the way it absorbed everything else the house required of it, without complaint that anyone upstairs ever heard, and without any adjustment whatsoever to the number of people available to meet it. The house itself was not the only building on the estate absorbing this kind of punishment that day, and it is worth stepping outside its walls briefly, into the stable yard, before returning for good to the drawing room and its fire. Rain did not confine its demands to the people working indoors. It reached the coachman, the grooms, and the stable boys with a force at least as brutal as anything Alice or Sam or Ivy experienced, and their part of this story tends to disappear from popular accounts of country house life almost entirely, since nobody writing wistfully about a cozy Victorian rainy day tends to picture the stable yard at all. 5 horses had gone out with the shooting party that morning, along with 2 more pulling, the light carriage that had originally been meant to collect the guns, and the day's game later that afternoon, and every one of them came back soaked through, mud caked to the knee, tack heavy with wet leather. A wet horse cannot simply be turned back into its stall and left. It has to be rubbed down thoroughly, coat and legs both, to prevent the animal chilling overnight, a job that on an ordinary day took perhaps 20 minutes per horse. And on a day like this one, with every animal soaked to the same degree, consumed the better part of 2 hours for the head groom and his single stable boy working together without pause. The tack itself presented its own version of the boot room's crisis. Point. Wet leather harness and saddlery, like wet boots, could not simply be hung up to dry near a stove, since direct heat cracked and warped good leather within a season. And grit worked into stitching left unattended overnight could saw through thread and leather alike. Every strap, buckle, and length of rein had to be wiped down, worked over with saddle soap, and left to dry slowly in a properly ventilated tack room, then oiled the following day once fully dry. A 2-stage process that meant the stable yard's own version of Sam's boot room crisis. Regardless of how late the grooms worked that night. The head groom, a broad-weathered man named Coke, who had worked with horses his entire adult life, took a particular pride in never once, in 20 years of service, allowing weather to leave a lasting mark on any animal or any piece of tack under his care, a pride the historian Pamela Sambrook has noted, whose skilled labor gave them a measure of status and independence most indoor servants never had access to. That pride did not make the work itself any less exhausting. Ken. Coke and his stable boy were still out past midnight that Tuesday, working by lantern light in a cold, drafty stable block, considerably less comfortable than even Alice's attic, finishing the last of the tack while the rest of the household, upstairs and down alike. The quiet observation worth carrying forward from the stable yard is that the household's actual boundary of invisible labor extended well past the walls of the house itself, out across the whole working landscape of the estate, wherever weather touched anything the family used or relied upon. A clean, dry carriage waiting at the front door the next morning, its wheels free of yesterday's mud, its cushions dry, its horses groomed and rested, represented exactly the same kind of manufactured, effortless seeming comfort as the fire in Lady Vane's drawing room, produced by exactly the same pattern of unseen labor, performed after dark by people the family would likely never think to ask about at all. It is worth naming directly, before drawing this account to its close, exactly which modern image all of this has been quietly arguing with from its opening scene onward. Because the argument works better made plain than left implicit. The rainy Victorian afternoon, fire lit, tea poured, novel open, has become something close to a small aesthetic movement in its own right in recent years, circulated endlessly in photographs of restored manor houses, in period drama stills, in the soft, warmly lit imagery that now accompanies almost any online description of cozy historical living. There is nothing wrong with finding that image appealing. It is appealing, and as this account has said from its very first page, it is not even inaccurate as far as it goes. What the image leaves out, consistently and by design, is any hint that the coziness on display was ever produced by anything at all, let alone by a household of exhausted, chilblained, chronically underslept people working in conditions. A photograph of a beautifully laid fire says nothing about the coal yard in the rain. A painting of a lady at her window with a novel says nothing about the girl who scrubbed the floor beneath that window twice in one day. The aesthetic survives generation after generation, precisely because it has never once had to reckon with the labor sitting just outside its frame. And every time it gets reproduced without that labor, the omission repeats itself a little more completely, until an entire style of nostalgia rests on a version of the past that quietly erases most of the people who actually lived through it. None of this is an argument against finding the image beautiful, or against the very real comfort a warm fire and a rainy window still offer anyone lucky enough to have both today. It is simply an argument for knowing what you are actually looking at when you look at it, and for extending that knowledge, if you can, to the ordinary, unglamorous, physically demanding version of the same day that a great many more people were actually living through at the time, on their knees, in the cold, out of sight of any window worth painting. Step back, now from the particulars of this one Tuesday, from the mud and the boots and the cold and the wool, and a handful of larger patterns come into view, patterns that reach well beyond Ashcombe Hall and describe something closer to the underlying logic of the entire Victorian country house as an institution. The first and most basic of these patterns is that comfort, in a house like this one, was never a natural condition that simply existed when the weather cooperated. It was a manufactured product assembled fresh every single day out of coal, water, clean linen, and dry wool, by a workforce whose entire function was to make that assembly invisible. The word cozy, applied to Lady Vane's drawing room on a rainy afternoon, describes an atmosphere that felt spontaneous and effortless to the people enjoying it, precisely because an enormous amount of effort had gone into making it feel that way. There was nothing accidental about the fire burning cheerfully in her sitting room grate. It was the end product of a specific chain of decisions and physical labor, coal hauled from a yard in the rain, ash riddled out before dawn. A fire laid and lit and tended and fed again every hour or two throughout the day, performed by a person whose presence in the room was carefully arranged never to register. Strip away that labor, even for a single day, and the cozy Victorian rainy day collapses immediately into the cold, damp, poorly lit reality it would otherwise have been, for family and servant alike. The second pattern concerns what rain specifically did to the household, and it is not what the modern romantic image suggests. Bad weather did not create a shared hardship that drew the house together, family and staff alike hunkering down against the same storm. It created a hardship gradient doubling the workload of everyone below stairs, while at the same time doubling the comfort available to everyone above it, since more hours indoors meant more fires wanted, more hot water requested, more meals served at the family's leisure rather than around any fixed schedule. The same storm that gave Lady Vane an unusually pleasant, unhurried afternoon by her fire gave Alice an unusually brutal, unrelenting one on her knees and on the stairs, and the distance between those two experiences, already considerable on an ordinary day. Rain did not level anything in this household. It amplified whatever inequality was already built into the building's own architecture. The third pattern lives in the body itself, in the specific cumulative physical cost that never appeared on any account book or wage ledger at Ashcombe Hall, because nobody was keeping a ledger for it. Chilblains on Alice's fingers. A permanent stoop developing in her back before she turned 17. Housemaid's knee, recognized and named by the medical literature of the era, precisely because it appeared so reliably in servants who spent their days kneeling on cold stone. A wet cough in Ivy's chest that would worsen every autumn for the rest of her working life. Barrow's shoulders, rounded forward by 3 decades of hauling coal scuttles across a service yard. None of these costs were dramatic enough, individually, to interrupt the smooth appearance of a well-run household on any single day. Accumulated across years of service, across a working life that for many servants began at 12 or 13 and continued for decades, they amounted to a form of taxation nobody called by that name, paid entirely in the currency of a body's own long-term health, and paid almost exclusively by the people whose comfort the household's actual finances were never designed to protect. The fourth pattern is the one that took the longest in researching an account like this one to see clearly, and it concerns invisibility itself, treated here not as a side effect of servants' low social position, but as a deliberate, engineered technology in its own right. Every bit as sophisticated in its way as the copper hot water can or the coal-fired kitchen range. Backstairs, green baize doors. Service passages built to avoid the family's usual routes through the house. The turn-to-the-wall gesture housemaids were trained to perform on sight of an approaching employer. Each of these was a specific design choice made by an architect, a housekeeper, or an entire culture of etiquette writers, aimed at solving a specific problem, namely how to extract a full day of physically demanding labor from household staff while ensuring that the people paying for that labor never had to witness, and therefore never had to reckon with what it actually looked or felt like. The technology of concealment in a house like Ashcombe Hall was every bit as considered and as effective as the technology of comfort it existed to protect. Taken together, these 4 patterns describe something more specific than simple Victorian hardship, a subject broad enough to apply to almost any period of history examined closely enough. They describe a particular kind of household economy, one in which weather functioned as a stress test, revealing with unusual clarity exactly how much of the family's comfort depended on labor they had arranged never to see. On an ordinary dry day, the gap between Lady Vane's experience of Ashcombe Hall and Alice's experience of it was already wide. On a wet one, that gap did not narrow into some shared, weather-beaten solidarity. It simply widened further in exact, measurable proportion to how much harder the rain made Alice's actual work, while making almost no difference at all to how Lady Vane's day was permitted to feel. A fifth pattern, quieter than the other 4, sits underneath all of them and is easy to miss precisely because it never announces itself the way mud or coal or a chilblain hand does. It is the pattern of accumulated ordinary endurance the specific skill of simply continuing hour after hour without any expectation of relief, recognition, or even much acknowledgement that the day had been unusually hard. Alice did not experience that Tuesday as a singular ordeal worth remembering in detail. She experienced it as one difficult day among many, distinguishable from the days before and after it mainly by degree rather than kind. And that ordinariness, more than any single task described here, is what made the whole system sustainable for as long as it lasted. A household could not have functioned on the backs of people who broke down under this kind of pressure. It functioned generation after generation, precisely because girls like Alice, boys like Sam, and women like Ivy and Mrs. Sassis, yeomen kept finding a way to get through the next hour, and then the one after that, without the household ever needing to notice the cost of it at all. There is something clarifying about seeing the pattern laid out this plainly, about recognizing that the particular romance modern audiences attach to a Victorian rainy day. The fire, the novel, the rain against Douglas, was never a lie exactly, but was always, from the very beginning, describing accurately the experience of perhaps a dozen people in a house that depended on the labor of 2 or 3 dozen more. Alice's Tuesday and Lady Vane's Tuesday took place in the same building, under the same roof, during the same hours of the same storm, and produced 2 almost entirely unconnected experiences of what a rainy day. It is worth pausing, before returning to the drawing room where this account began, to ask a more uncomfortable question than any raised so far, which is how anyone actually knows what a day like Alice's felt like at all. Given that Alice herself, as a specific, named individual, never existed, the honest answer says as much about the era's own priorities as anything already described. Country houses like Ashcombe Hall kept meticulous records of almost everything except the interior experience of the people who ran them. Account books survive in real archives across England, cataloguing exactly how much coal a household burned in a given month, exactly what wages a housemaid or hallboy earned, exactly how many yards of livery cloth a footman's uniform required. Architectural plans survive too, showing precisely where the back stairs ran, how far below grade the service wing sat, how many bedrooms the attic contained, and how each one was allocated. What almost never survives, because almost nobody thought to record it, is a servant's own account of what any of this actually felt like from the inside. Kneeling on that stone, carrying that water, sleeping under that damp roof. This is where a source like the diary of Hannah Colwick becomes disproportionately valuable to historians of this period, precisely because it is so rare. Colwick could read and write at a level many servants of her class could not, and she was encouraged, unusually, by someone in her life to keep a daily record of her work, which means her diary survives today as one of only a small handful of accounts written by a Victorian domestic servant in her own words, rather than filtered through an employer's ledger. R. A Social Reformers Report. The historian Liz Stanley, who has spent a career editing and studying Colwick's diaries, has written about how carefully that rarity needs to be handled, since a single surviving voice can never speak for the hundreds of thousands of servants whose daily experience left no written trace at all, but it can, used carefully, confirm and texture the kind of physical detail that other, more official records only gesture toward in passing. Most of what fills out this account, the specific weight of a hot water can, the composition of dubbin and blacking, the layout of a typical service wing, the medical recognition of housemaids' knee and rheumatism among domestic staff, comes from exactly this kind of triangulation, official records read alongside the rare surviving personal accounts. Cross-checked against household manuals like Mrs. Beaton's, and increasingly in recent decades, tested directly through the kind of experimental history practiced by historians like Ruth Goodman, who has spent years actually performing period domestic labor rather than simply reading about it, precisely to recover the physical bodily knowledge that written records so rarely bothered to preserve. Pamela Sambrook's research into the country house as a working building, and Judith Flanders's work on the physical architecture of the Victorian home fill in much of the remaining structure, the how and the where, that turns isolated facts into something resembling a coherent day. Alice herself, then, is not a discovery pulled whole from any single archive. She is a reconstruction, built the way a conservator rebuilds a damaged painting, filling the gaps between surviving fragments with material drawn from everything known about paintings of that period and that school, careful never to invent a detail the surrounding evidence does not support. Her name is invented. Her particular pressed violet and her particular exchange with Sam in the passage that night are invented too. Small human details assembled to give a documented set of tasks and conditions a face and a voice, rather than leaving them as a dry list of duties in an old account book. But the tasks themselves, the mud, the boots, the coal, the water, the wool, the damp, the invisibility, and the specific physical toll each one exacted, are drawn as directly as the surviving record allows from the documented reality of English country house service, verified across multiple independent historians working from multiple independent kinds of evidence. This matters, in the end, for reasons beyond simple accuracy. The absence of servants' own voices from the historical record was not an accident of who happened to keep diaries and who did not. It was itself a product of the same system this account has been describing throughout, a working life so long, so exhausting, and so thoroughly organized around invisibility that almost nobody living it had the time, the energy, the education, or the encouragement to sit down at the end of a day like this one. Alice's Tuesday was in the most literal sense unrecorded, not because it did not matter, but because the entire structure of her life left no room for the recording. Reconstructing it, now carefully and honestly from the fragments that do survive, is not an act of invention so much as an act of overdue attention, aimed at a kind of life the historical record itself was never designed to preserve. Return now to the drawing room at Ashcombe Hall, to Lady Vane in her dove grey wool, her novel face down across her knee, the fire built up high, the rain still streaking the diamond panes in long, wavering lines. Nothing about the scene itself has changed since the beginning of this account. She is still exactly as composed, exactly as warm, exactly as pleasantly settled into her afternoon as she was the first time we looked at her. What has changed is everything you now know about how that composure was produced, and it is worth sitting with the image one more time in full possession of that knowledge before letting it go. You know now that the fire beside her was built from coal hauled by hand through a muddy service yard in the rain, carried up 4 flights of narrow, uncarpeted back stairs by a girl whose knees were already aching before she reached the first landing. You know that the entrance hall she crossed on her way into luncheon that day had been scrubbed clean of more mud twice already, once before the meal and once again well after 10 that night, by the same girl on her hands and knees with a bucket of water gone the color of wheat tea. You know that the dry, warm clothes on her own back that evening existed only because a laundry maid 2 floors below had spent the entire afternoon coaxing water out of heavy, sodden wool in a room thick enough with steam to feel on the skin. You know about the boots blacked by a 13-year-old boy alone in a windowless room, about the chilblains and the housemaid's knee and the permanent stoop developing in a 16-year-old's back, about an attic bedroom with no fireplace and a damp wall behind an iron bed frame, and about a system of backstairs green baize doors, and turned faces engineered specifically to keep every part of this from ever crossing Lady Vane's notice at all. none of that knowledge changes what actually happened in that drawing room on that particular Tuesday. Lady Vane really did have a pleasant, restful afternoon. The fire really did stay warm. The tea really was hot. The cake really was fresh. And the rain against the window really did make the whole scene feel, to everyone sitting in it, exactly as cozy as the modern imagination still likes to picture it. The portrait was not false. It was simply and radically incomplete, a single, carefully lit corner of a much larger house, presented as though it were the whole of the house, when in fact it depended entirely on rooms and corridors and staircases the portrait was never going to show you. Alice is not in that portrait, and she was never meant to be. She spent that same Tuesday afternoon, evening, and a good portion of that night in exactly the conditions this account has spent its length describing. And she woke the next morning, whatever the weather happened to be, and did some version of it all again. Because a household like Ashcombe Hall did not pause its demands to let a 16-year-old girl recover from the day before. She was not a figure in a genre painting of comfortable English country life, gazing serenely out at a well-kept garden. She was a specific, physical person, chapped hands and aching knees and a pressed violet hidden in the back of a prayer book, doing exactly what her position required of her, day after day, in a house that depended completely on nobody upstairs ever looking closely enough to notice. There is a kind of dignity in that endurance that has nothing to do with how the era chose to see it. Alice was not admired for what she did on a day like this one. She was, at absolute best, briefly and quietly thanked by an equally exhausted housekeeper on her way to bed, a small kindness that mattered to her precisely because it was so rare. She was not pitied either, not by the people she served, who mostly did not think about her at all, and pity, in any case, would have missed the point of her as thoroughly as the drawing room portrait did. She managed the demands of a difficult body, an unforgiving world, with real skill and real endurance, the kind any person deserves to be seen clearly for, whether or not their own sentry ever thought to look. Somewhere in the attic above that drawing room, well, after the rain had eased into its final light patter against the dormer window, Alice slept the specific dreamless sleep of a body that had given everything it had to give for one day and had nothing left over for anything else. Not worry, not resentment, not even much awareness of the damp wall a few inches from her shoulder. She did not know, and had no particular reason to wonder, that a house nearly a century and a half in the future would eventually solve almost every physical problem her day had contained, with a boiler instead of a coal scuttle, a washing machine instead of a wooden airer on a rope, a tap instead of a copper can, and 4 flights of stairs. She simply did what the day required, went to sleep, and woke the next morning to find out what the next one would require of her instead. Downstairs, the fire in Lady Vane's own bedroom grate had been fed once more before midnight, quietly, by whichever maid held that particular duty that night. And it burned on, small and steady, long after the house around it had gone fully silent. The rain by then had stopped altogether, leaving behind only the ordinary quiet of a large house at the end of a hard day. Every fire banked, every boot blacked, every floor scrubbed clean of a storm that would by morning have left no visible trace on the building at all. It had, however, left its trace elsewhere, in a set of aching knees and reddened knuckles, and a cough that would return every autumn for years afterward, in bodies that the house's own architecture had been built, quite deliberately, never to let anyone upstairs see clearly. Seen clearly now, at this distance, Alice's Tuesday asks for nothing more than that, to be looked at plainly, once, for exactly what it actually was.